You want to talk about someplace that's cold? Well, that would be Greenland. I'm joined today by author. You've written for the New York Times Magazine, Washington Post, several other national publications. But what you're talking about with Greenland is really relevant right now.
That's right. Just a couple weeks ago, Greenland underwent this huge melting where it was losing, tens of billions of tons of ice that were melting off the top of Greenland, pouring into the water, and in the process of that, they're raising sea levels.
I just said, yeah, Greenland is a place that's cold, but it's actually warming up quite a bit.
It is, and it's pretty alarming because whatever happens in Greenland, as far away as it seems, either physically, geographically, and in our imaginations, it's actually affecting the way we live if you're anywhere near a coast.
So for people who may not know, they think, gallons or millions of gallons or billions of gallons of ice melting. I mean, what does that actually look like? Because you've seen it.
Right. For the last melting, which was just this past week, when this warm front from Europe went up over Greenland, one scientist calculated that over the course of 2 days, Greenland lost enough water to cover all of Florida by about 5 inches.
Wow.
So that gives you, and that's just 2 days of melting. Now, Greenland also, it loses ice other ways. It has these massive glaciers that end at the ocean, and they break off huge icebergs, and they float away and melt also. So it's this kind of combination of forces of a warming atmosphere, warming oceans, all these things that are playing on the Arctic, making it warmer, melting the ice, and in turn sort of affecting the rest of us by raising sea levels.
Right, so alone that sounds really scary, but in the broader scheme, in kind of the big picture, what is this indicative of?
Well, what we know is that the Arctic is warming twice the rate of the rest of the world. So as much as we sort of feel that things are getting warmer, growing seasons are changing, if we want to look at the future, we can just kind of look to the north, because that's unfortunately where we're headed. And it's indicative of, as I said, warmer air temperatures as sort of, these sort of warming systems move up towards Greenland and towards the Arctic. And they not only melt the ice on Greenland, they melt the sea ice, which is the floating ice cover that covers the Arctic Ocean. And the big worry really, in some ways, is that not that Greenland has a bad day of melting. It's that there are these kind of tipping points, that if this keeps happening year after year, that it can become self-perpetuating, that eventually the ice sheet keeps melting and getting lower in elevation, and at lower temperatures, at lower elevations, there's warmer temperatures, and then it melts some more. So we get into a place where the more Greenland melts, the more it might melt.
So you don't even need a heat wave at that point to cause serious damage.
Exactly. I mean, the good news, if there is any at all, is that we're not there yet. I mean, we can turn things, if not around, we can sort of avert the worst impacts. That takes us down into a conversation of, what are we going to do about climate change? How do we sort of stop putting so much CO2 in the air, which is really raising temperatures, not just here, but especially in these sort of more fragile environments up north.
Right, and I don't know that I introduced you appropriately at the beginning, Jon Gertner, who obviously has written for the New York Times Magazine, but also now you're writing your own book specifically about Greenland and how it plays into the overall broad picture. But it's not just about climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I worked on it for about 5 or 6 years, and there are a lot of great books on climate change. I also wanted to sort of look specifically at this ice sheet, which it holds about 24 feet of sea level rise if it all melted. It's not all going to melt tomorrow. It might melt in hundreds or even a couple thousand years. But what it, I think, shows us is how scientists have sort of investigated this place over the course of a century, and how we've come to know what we know about climate change, how we've learned to measure ice sheets and measure these changes in the Arctic, and how we've taken that information and really kind of, now we're sort of, I think, struggling with it. What do we do to avert these worst impacts? How do we make policies that prevent the worst sort of scenarios from happening?
Is it really so doom and gloom?
I think in many ways we can look ahead to the future and see different paths that we can follow. So on the one hand, if we keep going at the way we're going, yeah, unfortunately, I think we're in for something catastrophic. Mm-hmm. If we change the way we're living, if we change the way we're, emitting CO2, switching over to electric cars, clean energy, renewable energies, I think we'll be much better off. But in my book also, I sort of looked at the science of climate change, which is gloom and doom in many respects, but if you look at the history of how scientists have come to these discoveries, I think it's also a story of great discoveries and scientific achievements. And we can also look at climate change, or the discovery of climate change, as really one of the great achievements of of 20th century science, of how we've learned to understand the impacts of what we've been doing to the environment.
So at least there's a silver lining when it comes to it, that there's all these achievements and some positivity with regards to that. As someone who's been there, you've seen it firsthand. I mean, I imagine every time you go back, it's probably pretty striking, the changes.
Yeah, you can, and especially in some places. I mean, it's hard to almost explain how massive this Greenland ice sheet is. And it's not even as big as Antarctica's ice sheet, which is, these are the last two remnants of the Ice Age. And to go to the edges, you can see it recede really sometimes year by year in massive amounts. It not only goes back from the edges, it kind of goes down in elevation. And it gets darker and muddier and grittier every year. And these are changes that your eye can kind of be deceptive. What we really need and what we really do is use satellites and these airborne missions to measure precisely how much ice these ice sheets are losing. And that gives us these calculations, which are pretty staggering. I think in this year, I mean, Greenland might lose 300, 400, 500 billion tons of ice. It's unclear yet till the end of the year, but I mean, these are just massive, massive changes.
As someone who's been that many times, for you, what was the most striking thing about writing this book that you either stumbled upon or realized or didn't know going into it?
I think one thing that has constantly struck me is because I spent a lot of time with scientists from NASA, from the national science groups, and from Danish and European scientists, was how challenging, how hard-won, how much work has gone into finding the information that we see and almost take for granted on the news every night. These figures,
or dismiss.
Or dismiss. These figures I'm talking about, 400 billion tons. I mean, these are the fruits of many years of work, not just by scientists, but by engineers who built satellites and all these things, or scientists who drill into the ice sheet and pull out these cores and have spent really, winter after winter away from their families to do this work. I mean, they love this work, but it's yielded insights for us that I don't think it's easy to understand the sacrifices they've made and the hard work that's involved. And that came to me, time and time again whenever I went to Greenland.
Well, so if folks want to learn more about this, how can they, what's the name of your book? Where can they find it?
Sure. It's The Ice at the End of the World, an epic journey into Greenland's buried past and Earth's perilous future. It's published by Random House, just came out a couple weeks ago, and it's in any bookstore or on Amazon.
Perfect, by Jon Gertner. Jon, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks very much. Thanks for having me.